First up, for the cover piece this week, Jonathan Stewart takes a look at the New World Order. As the violence continues in the Middle East and Ukraine, are we beginning to see America's world order crumble and Iran-led politics making gains? Jonathan joins me now alongside former U.S. Defense Secretary Richard Haas. Jonathan and Richard, thanks for joining me. Jonathan, you are currently based in Israel. Can you give us an update?
Yes, obviously the main event of the last 24 hours has been the visit of President Joe Biden. But in terms of the broad situation, there are still 300,000 Israeli reservists mobilized. They are in their great majority currently waiting on the border with Gaza. There is still Israeli air action over Gaza. And something which I think has not been sufficiently noted in global coverage is that the situation in the north on Israel's border with Lebanon is also extremely tense. There have been several launches today of anti-tank missiles by the Lebanese Hezbollah organization at positions of the Israel Defense Forces, one of them in a place called Shtula. There were a number of service people wounded. So the situation to the north is also extremely tense. So I think those are the main points I would raise just in terms of an immediate update.
Jonathan, thank you for that update. You write the cover piece for this week's magazine about the New World Order, suggesting that history is moving Iran's way. Can you talk us through it?
Well, my sense as someone who's been looking at the region, living in the region, covering the region now for quite a few years, is that the main beneficiary of a number of historic events underway in the Middle East over the last decade and a half to 2 decades has been the Islamic Republic of Iran, specifically the breakdown or fragmentation or even partial collapse of governance in a whole number of Arabic-speaking states of quite long historic standing. And specifically, I would point to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and to some degree Yemen also, where central governance has to some degree broken down. And the Iranian practice, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, methodology and praxis of irregular warfare, namely the construction of or support for political/military organizations in neighboring countries, has proven to be a remarkably useful method for the implanting of political power and influence in those collapsed spaces. So that the loss of the Palestinian Authority of control of the Gaza Strip in 2007 and its loss of it to the Hamas organization is a local variant of a process which is visible across the region and which has in its total brought to the Islamic Republic of Iran a previously unprecedented level, I would say, of influence and power across broad spaces in the region. And the current, I would say, events regarding Gaza are a product of that process in the sense that regardless of whether Iran sort of pulled the trigger or was in control tactically of the events of October 7th, which we don't know and probably will never know, the Hamas military capacity and ability comes from and only from the relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran based on the broader regional strategy, which I just tried to outline.
Richard, as a former defense secretary, what do you make of Jonathan's comments there? Do you think that history is headed Iran's way? And is America still the global policeman of the world?
Well, there's lots in there. I don't think America ever was, quote unquote, the global policeman of the world. Even at the height of its influence, there were many things going on in the world that the United States was not in a position to control. But clearly we're living in a world of a more distributed power. And the United States has experienced, shall we say, quite a few setbacks in the Middle East, obviously, most apparently in Iraq. And also the United States now is somewhat more focused elsewhere on Europe and on what's now called the Indo-Pacific. In terms of the region itself, I think what Jonathan laid out is true in the sense that Iran has increased its influence significantly across the region, from Yemen through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon. At the same time, Iran can't be happy with the Abraham Accords, with the growth of acceptance of the reality of Israel in the region. Iran has also suffered all sorts of internal political and economic difficulties in recent years. And what was about to happen, interestingly enough, was a breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and a certain United States and Iran entering into a kind of modus vivendi. That is all blown up by events of the last 10 days, or so. So we'll now see how this plays out. But suddenly there's much more uncertainty, and unfortunately, much of it is negative. And it's easier to see how this war widens and how more problems come to the Middle East than somehow this is an unlikely way station to progress.
Richard, you wrote in Foreign Affairs that you think Washington should try to restrain military action in Gaza. What, practically speaking, would that look like?
I think it looks like what President Joe Biden is saying and doing in Israel. What he's doing is balancing support for Israel and its right to do certain things, but essentially saying, even though you have the right to do certain things, even though your emotions are telling you to do those things, you might want to think twice or three times before doing them. So the United States has clearly pushed back against the quote-unquote siege of Gaza, the cutting off of water and fuel, electricity, and so forth. So the United States has already pushed back against that, and clearly the United States is counseling restraint. And if I had to summarize the American policy, it's go after Hamas, but don't go after Gaza. Basically choose something that's much more discerning in what you do. So rather than going big, going small, whether it's from the air or from the ground. And my guess is that will be closer to what ultimately happens. That I think there's a lot of Israelis who also have fundamental doubts about the wisdom of going ahead with a large ground operation, all the costs, all the international outcry, the possibility it would lead to war widening. And then at the end of it, it's not clear again how you establish political authority in Gaza. Israel saw that in 2005, and it's not at all obvious to most observers that if they went in big now and then left, they would have a lot to show for it.
Jonathan, what do you make of Joe Biden and America's handling of the current crisis?
Yeah, I think what the administration is trying to do, and I think I agree with Richard on this, is to both support Israel, but also to try to restrain. I think that the dispatching of the two, or the aircraft carrier, USS Gerald Ford, and now Dwight D. Eisenhower is heading there as well, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, is deeply significant. And this is, I think, clearly an attempt to say to Iran and Hezbollah, as the president himself has said, well, don't get involved. Placing Iran and Hezbollah before quite a dilemma in a certain sense, because they've been talking in recent years now for what they call the unification of the arenas or unification of the fronts, which is supposed to represent this notion of a kind of united group of Islamist paramilitary movements behind Iran under Iran's leadership directed against Israel. And if Israel now does go into Gaza in a major way and Iran then does not intervene, they will look somewhat weakened in a Middle Eastern context, having not sort of backed up a great deal of rhetoric in recent years. At the same time, with the USS Gerald Ford there in the Mediterranean, Iran would be exercising, taking the real chance of tussling with, United States military response. So that will place them in a dilemma as well. I agree. I think the administration appears to be seeking to avoid a major operation on the ground. The government of Israel, we should be clear, has stated as its goal the removal of Hamas political authority in Gaza. It took a few days to say that. For a while, it was sort of not quite clear and different ministers saying different things. It has now said it at the top levels. If that is indeed the serious intention of the government of Israel, it's very difficult to see how that could be carried out other than by a major ground operation. I agree also that it's not at all clear, because Israel has not made it at all clear, what would replace Hamas governing authority in Gaza. That's something which the government of Israel has, I think, more or less on the record said, well, we don't know. We've not given that sufficient thought yet, which is not necessarily, which is not clarifying either. So that's a goal. If Israel wants that, it will have to carry out an operation on the ground. And I tend to agree that the Americans and others appear to be counselling against that. I guess we're going to find out in the days ahead what will take place. You can't keep 360,000 people permanently mobilized, right? That's how many reservists Israel has mobilized. You can't keep them in uniform, indefinitely. So something has to move and has to happen fairly close in the fairly close future, I would say.
Richard, you said on Twitter that President Biden's speech from Israel was, quote, nothing less than masterful. Others have been more critical, especially about his use of the phrase other team. When he basically used the word team, others have suggested it wasn't the most thoughtful phrase. I'm curious as to what has won over your praise for that speech. What specifically do you think he's getting right?
Look, people can focus on little things like his use of the word team, but the overall thrust of the speech, I thought, tried to thread a needle. On one hand, he's trying to, I think, rightly and understandably support Israel in the wake of these savage attacks. And Israel has the right, and as he's often said, the duty to respond. Terrorism cannot be allowed to be conducted with impunity. That's it. On the other hand, he is trying to essentially counsel Israel. He's trying to temper its rage, and he wants them to go in a much more refined sort of way. Again, as I said before, to focus on Hamas, not Gaza. And that's a difficult balance. He's got a lot of popularity in Israel. He's banked a lot of goodwill from his earlier speech and from American aid and so forth. And I think so far, at least, he's pulling off this very difficult balancing trick. Its speech was both filled with personal reflections, also had a lot of substantive policy. He announced a humanitarian aid package for the people of Gaza. So it's interesting. The policy here is quite subtle. And whereas some of the rhetoric is more, shall we say, quote unquote, pro-Israel, but the actual substance of what he's doing, I think, is quite measured. And I don't think he would disagree with a lot of what Jonathan and I have been saying about the doubts about the wisdom of going in large, this idea of eradicating Hamas. I just don't think it's physically doable or politically doable with military instruments. And even if somehow you were able to capture a lot of their leadership, the next day something like it would fill the political vacuum. It's not like the Palestinian Authority or Arab governments are ready to step in. So I think what ultimately, if we can somehow contain this crisis, we're probably going to have to deal with a Hamas-controlled Gaza for some time to come. And then the question is, will Israel and others find a way to moderate Hamas's behavior, not because Hamas has changed, but through deterrence?
Jonathan, the Abraham Accords were mentioned briefly at the start of our conversation. Is anything left of the Arab and Israeli rapprochement?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to be aware that none of the countries which signed on to the Abraham Accords, and most significantly, of course, United Arab Emirates, have pulled out as a result of the events of the last 11 days, and I don't expect that will happen. Very much not so. So the general trend with regard to that historic process is still there. In a certain sense, the events of the last days don't in any way push against the dynamic of the Abraham Accords, because in many ways, the Abraham Accords were specifically a notion of bringing together countries jointly opposed to precisely the kind of politics and the kind of military behavior, if I can put it that way, represented since October 7th. That's to say, United Arab Emirates famously is most primarily worried, deeply worried about the Muslim Brotherhood and about Sunni Islamism across the region. Hamas is a manifestation of precisely that style of politics. So October 7th and what's happened since doesn't in any way negate the logic of the Abraham Accords. In many ways, on the contrary, it precisely strengthens at least the security and defense element of the Abraham Accords, which was a very, very significant underlying factor. And in this sense, I agree that, of course, the rapprochement hoped for with Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will now not be happening along the same timeline. But the logic of the close connection between Israel and Saudi Arabia is reinforced, I would say, by the events of recent days. Can I just say also with regard to the issue of Hamas and removing its authority, you're absolutely right, of course, that as a political movement, it's not possible to destroy a political movement or a political trend using military power. Governing authorities, of course, can be destroyed using military power on the ground, and history is replete with examples of that. So in this sense, the doability of the goal Israel has set itself is there. You can do it if you're prepared to expend sufficient amount of energy and money and lives on the task. As to whether Israel will indeed undertake that now stated goal in the days ahead, sure, we don't know. But there is a coherence to the desire to destroy Hamas political authority if you want to pay the price for it. What is not yet coherent in the Israeli case is that the government has simply not related to what should and would come next. And that's surely a question that must be asked.
Richard, what do you make of that?
Well, again, the biggest problem is what would come next. And even if somehow you could root out Hamas, again, I'm not sure that's possible, because it's as much of an idea and an ideology and a network and a movement, and the mere process of rooting them out in some ways would create more converts. But the larger point is true, and there's the problem after 2005. A political vacuum would be there. I don't see anyone from the outside ready and able to fill it. The Palestinian Authority can't even really govern the West Bank. How is it going to govern Gaza? The Arab world really wants no part of it. The quote-unquote international community lacks the capacity and the will and the consensus to do it. So again, I just don't see it as a serious short-term alternative. In the long run, I'd love to see Hamas marginalized, but I think that's going to require a whole different political track to the Palestinian issue, and basically show the Palestinians who are willing to rule out force and live with Israel, compromise to reach some kind of a coexistence, that they will accomplish much more by going down that path than Hamas will by rejection and violence. But that's something that will take years or decades to work out, and that's something that could only begin once the dust settles here.
Richard, you've predicted before a new era of disorder due to the muting of U.S. dominance, but critics might say that it was the U.S. over-militarization that led to such conflicts in the first place. What would you make of that?
Look, the United States did overreach in certain cases, clearly in Iraq and to some extent in Afghanistan, but the idea that the United States is responsible in large part for disorder in the world is preposterous. That's just ideology. I'm not sure if it's coming from the far left, the far right, or both. I think historians will be critical of what the United States has done over the last 30 years when it came out from the Cold War with tremendous opportunities. And I don't think in some ways we've made good on those opportunities. But in many cases, it's for what we haven't done rather than for what we've done. And there's no way you can attribute Mr. Putin's violent war against Ukraine to what the United States has done, or now what Hamas has done, or the rise of Chinese power is simply a function of Chinese society and economic growth. The world deserves a lot of blame for what hasn't been done on global issues like climate change. So again, this criticism of the United States, I think, says a lot more about those doing the criticizing than it does about historical reality.
And Jonathan, just to finish, back to your cover piece on that new world order, how much of that world order can be attributed to the changes in attitude in places like America, but really across the West, when it comes to militarization and the appetite for these countries to get involved in other conflicts?
Yes, I think that is a very notable factor. That's to say, if we're thinking of the Middle East at least, the sense of a declining willingness of the West and of the United States in particular to respond to security threats. If we think, for example, of the attack on Saudi Arabian oil processing facilities by the Iranians through a proxy in September 2019, as one example of the sense that countries in the region have had of a declining willingness of America on that. But yeah, I think that processes can be attributed to that. I think, for example, the Abraham Accords in some ways was a coming together of countries traditionally aligned with the United States who jointly had become aware that the United States itself didn't want any more involvement inland and upstream in the Middle East, so to speak, and that therefore were required to make their own sort of links to one another. I do think that's right. I would say also, with regard to what's taking place in Gaza just now, that when we talk about various, this is not quite in terms of the question you asked, but just in terms of the earlier discussion, I think it's important for us to note when we talk about alternatives that October 7th was also a result of a failure of an existing policy. And that policy was the attempt to seek to coexist with continued Hamas rule in Gaza. So whilst undoubtedly, as we've been discussing, there are major difficulties associated with any project of replacing Hamas in Gaza, it is also the case, as we've seen so graphically demonstrated over the last 12 days, that coexisting with Hamas authority in Gaza may well be an impossibility, if at least we wish, as indeed we of course do wish, to provide security for the residents of Israel's south. So I think that's something which didn't quite come up in the discussion, which I wanted also just to put out there.
Jonathan and Richard, thanks so much for joining me.